The dust swirled across the Wyoming plains like ghosts of better times, and Eleanor Hartwell watched it settle on everything she was about to lose. The foreclosure notice crumpled in her trembling hands bore the red stamp of finality, 3 months to pay what she owed, or watch the Broken Arrow Ranch disappear like morning mist. 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, nestled between the Medicine Bow Mountains and the Laramie River, would belong to the bank before winter's end. Eleanor pressed her face against the window of the ranch house her father had built with his own hands, watching her remaining cattle graze in the distance. 23 head left of what had once been over 200. The drought had claimed 2 seasons. Rustlers had stolen her hope along with her livestock, and now the bank notes her father had signed in desperation were coming due with the persistence of a death rattle. She'd learned to ride before she could walk properly, could shoot a rattlesnake at 50 yards, and had delivered more calves than she could count, but none of that mattered to the men in suits who measured worth in dollars and cents rather than sweat and sacrifice. A woman alone was a liability, they said. An unmarried woman running a ranch was an impossibility they could no longer ignore. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her from her bitter reverie. Mrs. Abernathy, her nearest neighbor, was riding hard across the pasture, her weathered face etched with the kind of urgency that meant trouble. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, forcing a smile she didn't feel, preparing for whatever fresh disaster awaited. "Leaner child," Mrs. Abernathy called out as she dismounted, her voice carrying the weight of bad news. "I've just come from town. The bank's been asking questions about your situation, about you being here alone, trying to manage this place without a husband." Eleanor's stomach clenched like a fist. She'd heard the whispers in town, seen the sideways glances from the wives of successful ranchers. A woman alone was something to be pitied or scorned, never respected. But she'd never imagined it would affect her ability to conduct business. "What kind of questions?" Eleanor asked, though she dreaded the answer. "They're saying an unmarried woman can't be trusted with such a large operation, that maybe the land would be better served by someone with proper family values." Mrs. Abernathy's voice was gentle but firm. "I think they're looking for any excuse to foreclose early, Eleanor. Your marital status gives them one." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She gripped the porch railing until her knuckles went white, staring out at the land that had been her life, her purpose, her father's legacy. "What am I supposed to do? I can't marry someone I don't love just to save the ranch." Mrs. Abernathy studied her with shrewd eyes that had seen too much of life to be shocked by unconventional solutions. "Maybe you don't need to marry someone you love," she said slowly. "Maybe you just need to marry someone willing to help you save what matters most." 3 days later, Eleanor stood in the Silver Dollar Saloon in Laramie, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it over the off-key piano and drunken laughter. She'd never set foot in such an establishment, but Mrs. Abernathy had insisted this was where she'd find the kind of man she needed, someone desperate enough for steady work to agree to her unconventional proposal. The saloon reeked of whiskey and tobacco smoke, filled with the kind of hard-living men who'd seen too much of the world's harsh realities. Cowboys, drifters, and ranch hands nursed their drinks and their disappointments, each one carrying the weight of dreams that had died somewhere along the dusty trails that had brought them here. And then she saw him. He sat alone at a corner table, nursing a half-empty glass of whiskey with the careful attention of a man making his last drink last. Everything about him spoke of quiet strength and hidden depths. The way he held himself, the steady hands wrapped around his glass, the alert eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, touching his collar, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. There was something about him that seemed different from the others, more refined perhaps, though his clothes were as worn as anyone's. Eleanor approached his table with more confidence than she felt, her rehearsed speech suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of his quiet intensity. "Excuse me, sir? Might I have a word?" He looked up, and she was struck by the depth of intelligence in his brown eyes. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen pain and chosen to carry it with dignity rather than let it make him bitter. When he rose to his feet, his movements carried a grace that spoke of good breeding in better times. "Mom," he said, his voice cultured and tinged with what might have been a Virginia accent, "I'm Jake Morrison. How might I help you?" Eleanor had prepared herself for a rough cowboy, someone crude and simple who would be easy to manage. Jake Morrison looked like he'd be as easy to manage as a mountain lion and twice as dangerous to her peace of mind. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell," she began, then stopped, her carefully planned words deserting her. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Morrison. A business proposition." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he gestured to the empty chair across from him with the courtesy of a gentleman. "Please, sit. I'm listening." Eleanor perched on the edge of the chair, fighting the urge to fidget with her reticule. "I own the Broken Arrow Ranch about 20 miles north of here. I'm facing foreclosure, and I've recently learned that my status as an unmarried woman is being used against me by the bank." Jake's expression didn't change, but she caught a flicker of understanding in his eyes that gave her courage to continue. "I need a husband," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Not a real one, of course. Just someone to play the part long enough to convince the bank that I'm a respectable married woman capable of managing my affairs. I can offer room and board, and $100 when the arrangement is no longer necessary." Jake was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass slowly between his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "That's a dangerous game you're proposing, Miss Hartwell. What happens when people start asking questions about this sudden marriage? About where this husband of yours has been all this time?" Eleanor had anticipated this question. "We'll say you're my late cousin's widower from back east. That we've been corresponding since she passed, and you've come west to start fresh. It's not uncommon for people to marry for practical reasons on the frontier. And when your financial troubles are resolved, then you'll have fulfilled your contract, and you'll be free to go with no questions asked." She paused, studying his face. "I can see you're educated, Mr. Morrison. You don't belong in a place like this. This arrangement could benefit us both." Jake's smile was rueful, transforming his face from merely handsome to devastating. "You're right that I don't belong here. But then again, I'm not sure I belong anywhere these days." He was quiet again, and Eleanor held her breath. "When would this arrangement begin?" "Immediately. The bank expects to meet with me and my husband next week to discuss restructuring my loans." "And you're certain this is what you want?" "Once word spreads that Eleanor Hartwell is married, there's no taking it back without considerable scandal." Eleanor thought of her father, of the dreams he'd shared with her about building something lasting on this harsh but beautiful land. "I'm certain." Jake raised his glass in a mock toast. "Then I accept your proposal, Mrs. Morrison." The name sent an unexpected shiver through Eleanor. She'd never imagined her first experience with a married name would be part of an elaborate deception, or that it would feel so right coming from this stranger's lips. The ride back to the ranch was filled with the kind of awkward conversation that occurs between strangers trying to learn enough about each other to maintain a convincing lie. Eleanor discovered that Jake had indeed been born in Virginia, had served in the war, and had lost his family in circumstances he clearly didn't wish to discuss. Jake learned that Eleanor had been educated at a finishing school in Denver, had returned home to care for her ailing father, and had been running the ranch alone for 2 years since his death. What neither mentioned was the way Eleanor's breath caught when Jake helped her down from her horse, or how his hands lingered just a moment longer than necessary at her waist. They were both too practical, too wounded by their separate losses, to acknowledge the spark that passed between them like lightning before a storm. The ranch house was modest but well built, with a wide porch that faced the mountains and windows positioned to catch the morning light. Eleanor showed Jake to the spare room, acutely aware of how strange it felt to have a man in her home again. The space had been her father's domain, then her sanctuary, and now it would be shared with this enigmatic stranger who'd agreed to play the role of her husband. "The story is that we were married 3 months ago in a small ceremony in Denver," Eleanor explained as they shared a simple dinner of beef stew and cornbread at her kitchen table. "We kept it quiet because we were still in mourning for my father." Jake nodded, his attention focused on her face with an intensity that made her nervous. "Tell me about the ranch's problems. If I'm going to help you save it, I need to understand exactly what we're up against." Eleanor found herself explaining everything. The 2 years of drought that had devastated the grazing, the rustlers who'd made off with nearly 3/4 of her herd, the mounting debts and falling cattle prices that made it impossible to keep up with loan payments. Jake listened without interruption, asking only occasional questions that revealed a surprising depth of understanding about ranch management. "You've been handling all this alone?" he asked when she finished. I've had help from neighbors during roundups, but yes, essentially alone. Jake shook his head slowly. That's remarkable. I've known men who couldn't manage half as much with twice the resources. The compliment warmed Eleanor more than it should have. She'd grown accustomed to being told she was attempting too much, that she should sell the ranch and find a husband to take care of her. Hearing Jake acknowledge her competence felt like a validation she hadn't realized she desperately needed. The bank meeting is tomorrow, she said. Are you ready to convince them that Jake Morrison is devoted to his wife and committed to making the Broken Arrow profitable again? Jake's smile was genuine this time, transforming his entire face. Leave that to me, Eleanor. I can be quite convincing when the situation demands it. The Laramie First National Bank was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who might dare to default on their obligations. Eleanor smoothed her best dress, a deep blue wool that had been her mother's, and checked her reflection in the window one last time. Beside her, Jake looked every inch the prosperous rancher in a borrowed suit that fit him surprisingly well. Remember, Eleanor whispered as they approached the bank's entrance, we're deeply in love. Jake's response was to take her hand and bring it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Of course we are, darling, he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for passers-by to hear. How could any man not be utterly devoted to you? The words were part of their performance, Eleanor knew, but they still sent warmth rushing through her veins. She was beginning to understand that Jake Morrison was a dangerous man, not because he was cruel or violent, but because he was far too easy to believe. Harold Wickham, the bank president, was a thin man with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He greeted Eleanor with the kind of condescending politeness reserved for women who'd overstepped their proper place, but his entire demeanor shifted when Jake stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, Wickham said, extending his hand with newfound respect. I must confess I was quite surprised to learn of your marriage. Mrs. Hartwell, Morrison, had never mentioned having a suitor. Alana is wonderfully modest about such personal matters, Jake replied smoothly, his accent lending him an air of cultured authority. Would been corresponding for some time after my dear wife passed away. When I decided to come west for a fresh start, it seemed only natural that we should unite our lives and our business interests. Eleanor watched in amazement as Jake transformed before her eyes. Gone was the wary drifter from the saloon, replaced by a man of quiet confidence who spoke the language of business and breeding that men like Wickham instinctively understood and respected. I've been carefully reviewing the ranch's financial situation, Jake continued, producing a folder of papers that Eleanor hadn't seen before. With proper management and some strategic investments, the Broken Arrow has excellent potential for profitability. I'm prepared to assume full responsibility for the existing loans and provide additional capital for necessary improvements. Wickham's eyebrows rose as he examined the documents. Eleanor couldn't see what they contained, but whatever Jake had prepared was impressive enough to make the banker's attitude shift from barely concealed skepticism to genuine interest. These financial projections are quite optimistic, Wickham observed, but entirely realistic. Jake countered with quiet confidence. I've successfully managed larger operations back east. What this ranch needs is intelligent diversification, not just cattle, but horses, perhaps some selective farming. The land can easily support multiple revenue streams. For the next hour, Eleanor listened as Jake outlined comprehensive plans for the ranch that were both ambitious and practical. He spoke knowledgeably of breeding programs, of potential contracts with the Army for trained horses, of crop rotation systems that would improve the soil while providing additional income. It was clear he knew exactly what he was talking about, and by the time they left the bank, they had a restructured loan agreement that gave them the breathing room they desperately needed. Where did you learn all that? Eleanor asked as they walked back to their horses, still somewhat stunned by Jake's performance. Jake's expression grew distant, shadows crossing his face like clouds over the sun. I told you I'd lost my family. What I didn't mention is that I lost everything else too. My ranch, my plans, my entire future. Everything I just described to that banker, I tried to implement myself back in Virginia. It might have worked if the war hadn't taken my brothers, if disease hadn't claimed my wife and children, if I'd had more time to see it through. Eleanor felt something twist painfully in her chest at the raw grief in his voice. I'm so sorry, Jake. I had no idea. It's not your burden to carry, he said quietly, but his tone was gentler now. The point is, I know what needs to be done here. I've learned from my mistakes, and I understand what it takes to make a ranch like this succeed. The question is whether you're willing to trust me to do it." Eleanor studied his profile as they rode, seeing past his careful control to the man beneath, someone who'd lost everything once and was offering to risk his heart again. "This isn't just about the money anymore, is it?" "No," Jake admitted, his voice barely audible over the sound of their horses' hooves. "It's not." Over the following weeks, Eleanor watched Jake transform the ranch with the same quiet efficiency he'd displayed at the bank. He repaired fences with meticulous care, negotiated with neighbors to lease additional grazing land, and somehow convinced the local horse breeder to enter into a partnership that would provide steady income. He worked from dawn to dusk, his hands growing calloused again, his face taking on the weathered look of a man who belonged to the land. But it was the small, unexpected gestures that slowly undermined Eleanor's carefully constructed emotional defenses. The way Jake always had coffee ready when she came downstairs in the morning, steaming hot and perfectly brewed. How he'd begun reading aloud in the evenings, his cultured voice bringing new life to the words of Dickens and Shakespeare. The gentle patience he showed with the horses, earning their trust through understanding rather than dominance. Most dangerously of all, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. With a longing so profound it made her heart race, and her breath catch in her throat. They were scrupulously careful to maintain the pretense of their marriage when others were around, playing their roles with convincing affection. But alone together in the evenings, they observed an invisible boundary that neither dared to cross. They were business partners, nothing more, each too afraid of disrupting their fragile arrangement to acknowledge the growing attraction that crackled between them like electricity before a thunderstorm. The crisis came on a Tuesday evening in late September, when the aspen trees had turned gold and the first hint of winter touched the mountain air. Eleanor was in the barn checking on a mare that was close to foaling when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching fast. Her blood turned to ice as she peered through the barn door and saw 6 armed men dismounting in her yard, their faces hidden by dark bandanas rustlers. She reached for the rifle she kept mounted beside the door, but a cold voice stopped her dead. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, lady." Eleanor turned to find herself facing a man whose pale blue eyes held the kind of emptiness that marked him as truly dangerous. He was tall and lean, with the predatory stillness of a rattlesnake coiled to strike. "Where's that husband of yours?" he asked, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "In the house," Eleanor lied, praying Jake would hear the commotion and have the sense to stay away. "He'll be out here any minute." The man's smile was devoid of warmth or humor. "No, he won't. We've been watching this place for weeks. We know he rode out to check the north pasture 2 hours ago, and we know he won't be back until morning." Eleanor's heart sank as she realized the depth of their planning. Jake had indeed ridden out to check on the cattle, they'd moved to higher ground, and he'd planned to camp overnight rather than risk the treacherous mountain trail in darkness. "What do you want?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Same thing we've always wanted. Your cattle, your land. Your husband's interference permanently removed from our business." The man's eyes glittered with malicious intent. "Your Jake's been making things very difficult for us, organizing the neighbors, setting up patrols. Time someone taught him what happens when folks get too bold." Eleanor realized with growing horror that these weren't random cattle thieves. These were men who'd been systematically watching the ranch, learning their routines, planning something far more sinister than simple rustling. "The cattle aren't worth much after the drought," she said, desperate to buy time. "Take them and go." "Oh, this stopped being about cattle weeks ago?" the man said, his smile growing more unpleasant. "This is about teaching your husband a lesson he'll never forget. See, the best way to break a man is to take away what he values most. And word around town is that Jake Morrison values his wife very, very much." They bound her hands roughly with coarse rope and loaded her onto one of their horses, ignoring her struggles and protests. As they rode away from the ranch, Eleanor found herself thinking not of her own danger, but of what Jake would feel when he returned to find her gone. The thought of him blaming himself, of him walking into whatever trap they'd set, was almost more unbearable than her own fear. They rode hard through the darkness, following game trails deeper into the mountains than Eleanor had ever been. Finally, they stopped at an abandoned line shack that had probably been used by shepherds years ago. Eleanor was pushed inside the crude shelter, her hands retied behind her back, and left alone with a single guard while the others huddled outside making plans she couldn't quite hear. The guard was young, maybe 19, with nervous eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he held his rifle. Eleanor studied him carefully, looking for any weakness she might be able to exploit. "You don't look like a rustler," she said finally, breaking the oppressive silence. The boy jumped as if he'd forgotten she could speak. "Don't try talking to me, lady. I got strict orders about that. I'm just making conversation. It's going to be a very long night." "Won't be that long," the boy mumbled, then looked stricken, as if he'd revealed something he shouldn't have. Eleanor's blood chilled at his words and the fear in his eyes. "What does that mean?" The boy's face flushed red with embarrassment and panic. "Nothing, ma'am. I didn't mean nothing by it." But Eleanor could read the truth in his expression. Whatever the rustlers had planned, it wasn't going to end with her being released unharmed. They were using her as bait, counting on Jake's feelings for her to draw him into a trap from which neither of them would emerge alive. Outside, she could hear the men talking in low, urgent voices. One of them mentioned Jake's name and Eleanor strained to catch their words. "Should be finding our message about now. If he's got any sense, he'll come alone. Won't matter much either way." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as the full scope of their plan became clear. They'd left some kind of message for Jake, instructions that would lead him straight into an ambush. And knowing Jake's character, his sense of honor and responsibility, he would come. He would risk everything to save her, even though their marriage was nothing but an elaborate pretense. The realization crystallized something deep inside Eleanor, a truth she'd been desperately trying to avoid for weeks. Her feelings for Jake had nothing to do with their business arrangement. Somewhere between that first awkward dinner and the quiet evenings spent reading together, she'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with him, and now she was going to be the reason he died. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor's young guard dozed fitfully in his chair, rifle across his knees, while the other men took turns keeping watch outside, working as quietly as possible. Eleanor used a sharp splinter of wood from the wall to slowly fray the rope binding her wrists. It was painstaking work, and she had to freeze every time the guard stirred. But gradually she felt the rough fibers beginning to give way. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when she heard the sound of a horse approaching the camp. Her guard jerked awake, raising his rifle with shaking hands, while the voices outside grew excited and anticipatory. "That's him?" someone called out, right on schedule. Eleanor's heart nearly stopped as she heard Jake's voice, calm and steady despite the circumstances. "I'm here. Let her go." "Drop your weapons first," came the shouted reply, all of them nice and slow. Eleanor heard the sound of Jake's gun belt hitting the ground, followed by the metallic scrape of a rifle being set down. She redoubled her efforts with the rope, feeling it begin to fray more quickly under her desperate sawing. "Now step into the clearing where we can see you proper." Eleanor heard measured footsteps, then Jake's voice again, closer now and tight with controlled anger. "I've done exactly what you asked. Now honor your word and let her go?" "Oh, we'll honor our word." The leader's voice was thick with cruel satisfaction. "But probably not the way you were hoping." Eleanor's bonds finally gave way just as she heard the sounds of a violent struggle outside. She burst through the door of the line shack to find Jake surrounded by 4 men, his hands bound behind his back, a thin line of blood trickling from a cut above his left temple. "Eleanor, no," Jake shouted when he saw her genuine terror in his voice, but she was already moving. She grabbed a thick piece of firewood from the pile beside the shack and swung it with all her strength at the nearest rustler, catching him across the back of his skull. He dropped like a stone, and she snatched up his fallen rifle before the others could react. "Let him go," she commanded, surprised by the authority in her own voice. The remaining rustlers froze, clearly not having expected this development. Their leader's pale eyes narrowed as he calculated distances and angles, weighing his chances of reaching her before she could pull the trigger. "You don't want to do this, lady," he said, his voice attempting reasonableness. "You kill one of us, and the others will make sure you both suffer real slow before you die." "Maybe so," Eleanor agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I guarantee you'll be the very first to go." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came the blessed sound of approaching horses. Many horses, moving fast and purposefully. The rustlers heard it too, and their confident expressions began to waver. The sound grew steadily louder, closer, until Eleanor could make out individual voices calling their names. "Eleanor! Jake, where are you?" It was Mrs. Abernathy's voice, accompanied by what sounded like half the county. Eleanor felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as she realized their neighbors had organized a search party. The rustlers looked at each other with growing panic, then at the approaching sound of rescue. Their leader cursed viciously and pulled a wicked-looking knife from his belt, pressing it against Jake's throat. "You call out to them and he dies right here," he snarled at Eleanor. Eleanor's rifle never wavered from its target. "You heard him, and I'll kill you before your friends can draw breath to scream. Eleanor." Jake's voice was remarkably calm, almost conversational. "Do you trust me?" Without a moment's hesitation, she answered, "With my life." "Then when I say the word, shoot the man to my left." Eleanor shifted her aim slightly, finger tightening on the trigger. The rustlers were so focused on Jake and the approaching rescue party that they didn't notice her subtle movement. Now, Jake threw himself backward, driving his elbow hard into his captor's ribs while spinning away from the knife. Eleanor fired without hesitation, her shot taking the rustler on the left in the shoulder and spinning him around. The remaining men scattered like startled birds, but it was too late. The rescue party burst into the clearing, surrounding them with a bristling array of rifles and shotguns. In the chaos that followed, Eleanor found herself enveloped in Jake's arms, both of them trembling with reaction and overwhelming relief. She could feel his heart pounding against her chest, could breathe in the familiar scent of leather and soap and something uniquely him that had become so dear to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands moving over her face and arms, checking for injuries with desperate thoroughness. "I'm fine," she whispered, then looked up at him with sudden clarity. "Jake, I have to tell you something. I thought I'd lost you," he interrupted, his voice raw with emotion. "And I realized that somewhere along the way, this stopped being pretend for me. I love you, Eleanor. I love you so much it terrifies me." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as months of carefully suppressed feelings came flooding to the surface. "It stopped being pretend for me too," she whispered. "I love you, Jake Morrison. I love you more than I ever thought possible." He kissed her then, a kiss that was everything their careful charade had not been, desperate, passionate, achingly real. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor was dimly aware of their neighbors watching with expressions ranging from amusement to deep satisfaction. "Well," Mrs. Abernathy said with characteristic dryness, "I guess that settles any questions about whether this marriage is the real thing." Eleanor laughed, a sound that was equal parts joy and hysteria. "Actually, it's not real. We're not legally married." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "Is that so? Well, we'll have to remedy that situation immediately. Pastor Williams is right here with us, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to perform a proper ceremony." Eleanor looked at Jake, suddenly uncertain. "I don't want you to feel obligated because of what happened, or because people expect." "Eleanor," Jake interrupted, his voice infinitely tender. "I came west with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart full of grief. You gave me hope again, purpose, a reason to believe in tomorrow. If you'll have me, really have me, not as part of some business arrangement, but as your husband in every way that matters, I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of your love." Eleanor felt her heart swell with a happiness so complete it was almost painful. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll have you." Pastor Williams stepped forward, his weathered face creased with a genuine smile. "Well then, I suppose we'd better get started. We have a wedding to perform, and I can't think of a more beautiful setting than these mountains at sunrise." And so, in a clearing high in the Wyoming mountains, with the sun painting the peaks gold and their friends and neighbors as witnesses, Eleanor Hartwell and Jake Morrison spoke their vows for the second time. But this time, every word came from the heart, every promise was real, and every kiss was filled with the kind of love that would last a lifetime. The Broken Arrow Ranch flourished under their partnership, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Jake's plans for diversification proved as brilliant as he'd promised, and within 5 years, they'd not only eliminated their debts but had expanded their holdings to include 3 neighboring properties. More importantly, they'd built something neither had expected to find again. A love that was both passionate and enduring, founded on mutual respect, shared dreams, and absolute trust. Eleanor never regretted her desperate decision to hire a pretend husband, because in trying to save her ranch, she'd found something far more valuable. And Jake never regretted accepting her unconventional proposal, because in pretending to love Eleanor Hartwell, he discovered that nothing about the way he truly loved her was pretend at all.